Hey, good morning, and thank you for joining me. Morning. Um, I'll just get rid of that QR code for the time being, and I'll show it near the end of our session, just in case anyone else shows up. Okay, so um, and I have to tell you that I have another meeting after this, so we might need I might just blast through this session a little quicker. I'd like to talk about housing needs, housing demands, the actors and policies for this week. So, what is the difference between the need and the demand for housing? Housing demand refers to the willingness and ability to purchase a house, whereas housing need refers to the number of houses required given growth in households, itself usually derived from household size and the overall population growth. Now, for example, if someone returned from overseas and they need a house, they bought one, and another friend needs a house, low skilled, but they're low skilled, they have no funds, so they live with their siblings, be it their brother or their sister. So both of them needs a house, but only one uh, demands a house, and I guess you can see which one. The housing needs is usually driven, as I mentioned, by population growth, by the changes in household size, and then other external factors play as well, um, or impact housing needs as well, such as disasters or civil unrest, such as the case with millions of Ukrainians right now. Civil unrest and the demand for higher quality standards of living, um, the need or the demand for home ownership status, and so on, etc., etc. And those are the three main or the three primary drivers of housing needs. Um, Speaking of quality of life, quality of living or housing quality, we also have something called the uninhabitable house, or in our local housing lingo, it's known as rumah tidak layak huni, or RTLH, uninhabitable house. Now, every region, a lot of big city and namely big cities have um, a number of uninhabitable houses. It could be due to the fact that they may start out as illegal settlements. Um, some illegal settlements take the form of or become uninhabitable due to their low quality of low quality building, their lack of perhaps utilities, but even legal houses, even those with legal status, um, may be uninhabitable. They may be of low quality, because they may be situated in super dense neighborhoods where sorry where the inhabitants or where people share or they compete for resources such as groundwater, for example. Another factor that I mentioned earlier is home ownership status. Um, in this simple diagram, you can see the green circles. You can see the different sizes. The different sizes of the circles indicate the number of households, and then you can see the proportions in each the proportions in each region, seat, or in each city, of how many of these houses are privately owned, or people own, how many households, sorry, how many households own their house, or they live in a house that they own. Yeah, green is for owned, houses owned. Yellow is for, say, rent, and red is for others. As you can see, it's Quetta area, or in the greater Surabaya area, that most people own the house that they live in. However, for Surabaya, for example, that's I think a little more than I think about a third of the population still do not own their own home. I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that uh, home ownership home ownership is related to a lot of things. If people own the house that they live in, then they're more they are perhaps more invested. They have more at stake in their surrounding neighborhood, so they may invest more time, more resources, and ultimately making the neighborhood a better place to live in. People who rent may not have that may not have the same degree of attachment, so they may not be as invested and such. So home ownership goes a long way. It's not just about owning the house, but it also has other implications. Now, there are also different factors that drive housing demand. Um, but the demand for housing could be the amount of it could be related with the amount, space, quality, location of housing that consumers reveal these preferences through the rental or purchase of a dwelling. Housing demand is also reflected on housing elasticity, how consumers' demands change in response to changes in price, income, household size, and so on. For example, um, perhaps right now, if I were to demand for housing according to my current needs, according to my current household size, which is a household of four, um, then I would perhaps demand or require housing with proper lawn, um, for my a place for my children to grow. But once they grow up, once they leave the nest, then perhaps I would prefer to downsize, a house that is more manageable for an aging couple, for example. There is also the investment demand for a homeowner, additional demand for housing as an asset above and beyond what is demanded for consumption. So, um, a house for consumption is a house that we buy for us to live in. But a house as an asset means that it's an additional house on top of the house that we already own, and live in. So perhaps you might want to buy an additional house, to rent out, and so on. Um, Housing demand is also highly affected by housing careers. Housing careers is, if you put in a diagram, a housing career looks like this. Housing career is affected by one's life cycle, depending on the age, sex, household size, household composition, perhaps even affected by their life course throughout the ages, due to work placement, perhaps a change of status, marriage, and so on. It's also dependent on lifestyle, how much economic revenue you have, how much you're willing to invest, how much are you willing to pay, for rent, and so on. So status and other status factors dependent on, perhaps you want to be seen as a person of high status. Therefore you purchase a house in a high status area, or perhaps you don't really care. Then you perhaps you don't really care whether you live in a low or high status area. And of course, everyday life also comes into factor. Everyday life also affects our overall lifestyle. I guess the way every family operates is different, and so these differences translate into the sort of house, into the form of housing that they have, the form of housing that they live in, and the spatial configurations, and everything, and so on and so on. And ethnicity also contributes to the different lifestyles that we have. Um, yeah. The type of employ, what sort of job we do, what sort of industry that we're in, our employment status, the type of employment, what we do for leisure, and of course geographical location, and then life values, of course, achievement levels. Where are we at the moment? Are you at a managerial level? Are you at a lower level in your employment? And how attached you are to a place, how attached you are to a neighborhood, and so on. And of course, we can't leave out identity and other other factors that influence opportunities and constraints in housing demand, um, resources, local housing market, and the overall national welfare policy, and of course housing policies and such. And so these all affect the different our opportunities and the giving us leaving us with housing choices, and those then will ultimately influence our decision to stay or move, um, depending on the current housing, whether it satisfies our needs, does it cause us stress, or that will that drive will the current satisfaction and stress levels drive us to search for housing. When you do search for housing, you come back to this opportunities and constraints, um, which will then leave you to assess your choices and so on. So we do have something known as a housing shortage or housing backlog. Housing backlog. I'll give you a quick insight into the housing backlog formula. Sorry. So housing backlog is the total of additional factors or faktor penambah, um, minus the total of reducing factors atau faktor pengurang plus external factors. So additional factors or factors that add to housing backlog, the number of households that do not have a house, the number of damaged houses, which is categorized into light damage, heavy damage, and completely demolished, and the number of non-households or singles. Faktor pengurang, the total number of houses that are developed or that are provided, built by developers, number of houses built built independently, number of houses fixed, and number of houses that are uninhabited or empty houses. And these include the number of houses that are for rent, that are for sale. They've been on the market for a long time. So they why are they in the reducing factor? Well, because they present themselves as opportunities for people, for people to occupy a house, but they are not yet they have not yet met their potential customer. And then external factors, the number of damaged houses due to disasters, natural disasters. That includes floods, earthquakes, fire, and other disasters. I guess civil unrest, civil unrest also come into this because of government programs. Now, government programs could be say infrastructure provision. If the government is constructing a road adjacent to your house, and the construction process causes damage to your house, and that counts as a house or damaged house because of government programs. So, what's the outlook on the housing shortage? Well, this is a 2019. This is a 2019 data. The current data or the most recent data perhaps might look a little bit different to this, but as you can see, there's still a high number of housing backlog in the Greater Jakarta area. It doesn't seem like it in the greater Surabaya area, but I'm sure there are shortages. I'm sure there are shortages in these three regencies, Bangkalan, Lamongan, and Mojokerto. But it's just that it was not well documented back in 2019. But I'm sure that there are, or perhaps the numbers are so little that they present themselves as insignificant. So who provides housing, and what do they do? There are three forms of housing development modalities: informal, hybrid, and or just call it hybrid and formal. Now, each of these have different characteristics. So, informal developers, low-income households, private developers acting outside the formal system, middle and upper income citizens, perhaps they are dedicated rental property developers, they're perhaps landowners, they own the land and they want to build, using their own resources. And then there are also unauthorized self-builders who have incorporated rental rooms or rental units into their houses. So in short, informal developers like Rumah Swadaya, they develop their houses independently, whether it's a single house or multiple housings. And informal developers are found even more so throughout the developing world. Our government have a very high tolerance towards these informal development processes, and I think that somewhat contributes to the overall urban morphologies that we see. But at least our government designates land. You can build on this land, you can't build there, and so on. at least they designate the lands and are slowly making progress towards a more sustainable practice, especially for informal developers. Hybrid developers, hybrid developers can be community organizations. Um, it could be a combination of it could be a collaboration of the government, community organizations, NGOs, and the civil society. Um, there are some samples of hybrid development, such as the resettlement partnerships in Manila, the Philippines, and some in Bangkok, and Brazil and El Salvador. Um, there are also cooperatives. There are also cooperatives with support from NGOs and support from the government as well. And the government supports these efforts through land provision, such as in Argentina, Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and some in Egypt. Find out these different cases on your own. And finally, of course, formal developers. I think this needs um, no further explanation. Um, Formal developers, such as commercial housing developers, um, I think they're quite visible everywhere. Uh, Also, national government providing housing through subsidized housing. Um, Perhaps they even develop. They sometimes, a lot of the times they also develop their own form of housing in the form of public housing and special housing, government housing. So special housing could be rumah dinas. That's special. Oh, sorry, special housing, shelters for refugees and such. Government housing like rumah dinas for government employees. Now, the formal and informal housing development approaches differ. The formal development usually begin with planning, then building, service, and occupation, whereas the informal they start out with occupation first, and then perhaps finally they decide to they decide on planning the neighborhood, improving the neighborhood, and such. So that's why we see a lot of kampong improvement programs, because they start out with occupation, and they try to they continuously try to service, improve the house, improve the building, and ultimately, once their individual buildings have been improved, they move on to a greater scope, which is to improve the plan and improve the. Now, affordable housing is an issue that can be found throughout the world, be it the developing world and the developed world. Um, Most of the times, for a lot of people, housing is the entry point, or the entry point to a certain class, economic class. For example, if you're from the lower economy to the middle, if you want to upgrade yourself um, to the middle class, then one of the surest ways to do it is to attain a form of housing. However, that is easier said than done. So, what is exactly affordable housing? Affordable housing are dwellings built specifically for those whose income denies them the ability to purchase or rent on the open market. Um, Most of the times, these are uh, these are subsidized housing, and affordable housing can be provided because of market failure. which is an economic term describing a situation in a market where supply and demand are not in equilibrium. So in housing markets, this can occur when the cost of producing a house unit exceeds the price consumers can pay for it without subsidy. And then there's a housing affordability ratio, which is the median house price to median income. Now, this is an example of housing affordability ratio in the developed world. You can see countries like Australia, Ireland, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom have a relatively good housing ratio of median housing price to median income. But places like the United States, even Canada, have a very high ratio of very high ratio of median housing price to median income, which means that it is not really affordable. Sorry, 3 and under means housing is affordable. And so I got it mixed up the other way around. Countries like Australia, housing is not exactly affordable. The United States do have a relatively high level of affordability compared in comparison to Australia. Sorry, I read the. So what about the Surabaya metropolitan area or Indonesia? Well, Surabaya metropolitan area case, for example, it's been fluctuating, but the higher the number means the higher, or the higher the number means the lower the affordability, and I guess it speaks for itself, especially the market lately hasn't been very good. I've seen at least from my very small observation that there are a lot of houses that are for sale or for rent around where I live, and they've been on the market for a long time. In the area where I used to live, there are also several houses on the market, and they seem to have not been shifted. So they've been there for a while as well. Housing policies in housing policies promote, or they don't really suppress housing demand, but housing policies promote and affect the demand side and the supply side. It could be housing policies can be oriented towards the owner-occupied housing market by providing cash benefits for housing, to the rental housing market by fixed amount cash subsidy, and so on. So they take on different forms depending on which orientation the policies are geared towards. And the supply side, the policies can support the supply of public housing, perhaps subsidy to suppliers, subsidy to building materials and construction, thus influencing the quality. And then there are several housing policies to promote home ownership, either through cash benefits or housing subsidy, usually in the forms of subsidized down payments, or a reduction in the interest rate. It could be that they can't provide a reduction in interest rate, but they can provide a deduction from income tax. So if you're buying a house, if you're paying for a house, then perhaps there are policies or mechanisms that reduce the amount of income taxes you have to pay. For example, rather than paying 10% income tax, you're only paying 5% income tax. And They could also promote home ownership by upgrading quality standards and by construction of housing provision or housing construction of housing or provision of land for housing. And there are also housing policies the world over to assist low-income renters through housing vouchers, rent certificates, rent controls, public housing and subsidy to suppliers. Um, Housing policies. These are, I think, housing policies to assist low-income renters are not that, I think, not that common here. It's not really that common in other parts of the world as well, other than the country examples that are mentioned here. For example, I know that well, I know that in Australia's case, for low-income households, the members of the household who are of productive age, but they may be working in a they may be earning very little. They do receive government assistance from Centrelink, but that's but they receive income assistance rather than assistance to help pay rent. So they receive income assistance, but what they do with their income assistance is entirely up to them. So it's not specifically for renting a house or accessing housing. So these are some of the references that I've used to put these slides together. And if you have any questions or comments, you may you may unmute immediately. You may unmute directly. And while I wait for you to do so, here is the QR code once again for those of you who've just joined in. Okay. No comments or questions? Well then, thank you very much for joining me today. I have to get on anyways because I have another meeting immediately after this. So yeah, thank you for joining me today, and I hope that you've taken away some one or two things from this short session. Looking forward to seeing you again next week. So take care. Have a great day. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.